The last rays of sunset struck the small wooden cross as Vivian Shaw fell to her knees, her tears watering the freshly turned earth of a grave far too small for any mother to bear. Central City, Colorado, 1876, a town that had given her everything and then cruelly snatched it all away in a single night of fever that no doctor could cure. "Matthew," she whispered, her fingers tracing the crude letters carved into the wooden marker. "My sweet boy." The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the mining town, close enough to see the lamplights beginning to flicker in windows, but far enough that Vivian felt entirely alone with her grief. 3 weeks had passed since she'd buried her 4-year-old son, yet the wound remained as raw as the moment the light had left his eyes. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps until they were nearly upon her. When she turned, a tall silhouette stood against the darkening sky. A stranger, a cowboy with his hat respectfully removed, revealing dark hair that caught the last glimmers of daylight. He said nothing. Simply lowered himself to sit on the ground beside her, a respectful distance away, and placed his hat on his knee. The silence between them stretched, filled only with the evening breeze rustling through the pines. Vivian couldn't summon the energy to be startled or afraid. Grief had hollowed her out, leaving little room for any other emotion. Still, there was something comforting about not being entirely alone as darkness fell across the cemetery. Finally, after what might have been minutes or an hour, the cowboy spoke. "I lost my sister when I was 12, he said softly. "Scarlet fever." Vivian nodded, not looking at him. "Pneumonia," she whispered. "It took him so fast." The man nodded. "Name's Isaac Irwin," he offered. "I don't mean to intrude on your morning, madam, just seemed wrong for anyone to be sitting alone at dusk." "Vivian," she replied, her voice cracking. "Vivian Shaw." The wind picked up and Vivian shivered involuntarily. Without a word, Isaac removed his jacket and gently placed it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, pulling the worn leather around her. It smelled of horses, tobacco, and something indefinably wild, the open plains, perhaps. "But you should go. I'm not fit company for anyone these days." "Sometimes," Isaac said carefully, "the kindest thing one person can do for another is simply to sit with them when words have no power." So he stayed, and together they watched the stars emerge one by one above the Rocky Mountains, two strangers connected by nothing more than shared understanding of life's cruelest loss. When the chill of night fully descended, Isaac finally stood and offered his hand. "Let me walk you home, Mrs. Shaw. These mountains get mighty cold after sunset." Vivian hesitated but took his calloused hand. As she rose to her feet, she cast one last glance at the small grave. "Good night, my love," she whispered to her son, before allowing this quiet stranger to guide her down the path toward town. The walk back to Central City was silent. Street lamps cast long shadows as they passed the storefronts and saloons. Music and raucous laughter spilled from the Golden Nugget, the town's busiest establishment. Vivian kept her eyes down, clutching Isaac's coat around her shoulders. "I'm staying at the boarding house," she finally said as they approached the 2-story building on Pine Street. "Mrs. Holloway's." Isaac nodded. "I know it. Good woman, Mrs. Holloway." They paused at the steps leading to the front porch. Vivian slipped off his coat and handed it back. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin, for the coat and for sitting with me." "Isaac," he corrected gently. "And you're welcome, Mrs. Shaw." "Vivian," she replied. "Just Vivian now. There's no Mr. Shaw anymore. Hasn't been for 2 years." The words came out before she could stop them. Isaac accepted his coat with a nod. "Then good night, Vivian. I hope you find some peace and sleep tonight." "Peace and sleep is a luxury I've forgotten," she admitted, "but thank you for the wish all the same." With a tip of his hat, Isaac turned and walked away into the night. Vivian watched his tall figure disappear before entering the boarding house, wondering if she'd ever see the kind stranger again. Morning came harshly, as it always did now. Vivian had once been a sound sleeper, but since Matthew's death she woke with the first light, her mind immediately filled with the crushing reality of her loss. She dressed mechanically in her simple black dress, her movements automatic after weeks of mourning. Mrs. Holloway, a stout woman with graying hair and perpetually flour-dusted apron, greeted her with concern etched on her face. "You're looking peaky again, dear. Let me fix you some eggs." "Thank you, but I'm not hungry," Vivian said, the same response she'd given every morning. "Nonsense, Mrs. Holloway insisted, already cracking eggs into a pan. "You'll waste away to nothing, and that won't honor your boy's memory." The mention of Matthew sent a fresh wave of pain through Vivian's chest, but she sat at the table anyway, knowing Mrs. Holloway meant well. The woman had been kindness itself since Vivian had arrived in Central City 3 years ago, pregnant and alone after her husband Thomas had died in a mining accident back in Pennsylvania. As she picked at her eggs, the front door opened, and Mrs. Holloway's face brightened. "Why, Isaac Irwin. Haven't seen you in these parts for months. Where have you been keeping yourself?" Vivian looked up, surprised to see the cowboy from the cemetery standing in the doorway, hat in hand. In daylight, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell just below his collar and eyes the color of worn denim. His face was tanned and weathered from the sun, with the beginnings of lines at the corners of his eyes. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way, but there was something striking about him. "Been working cattle drives up north," he answered, his eyes meeting Vivian's briefly before returning to Mrs. Holloway. "Just got back to Colorado last week." "Well, sit yourself down and have some breakfast," Mrs. Holloway insisted. "You're looking thin as a rail." Isaac hesitated, glancing at Vivian. "Don't want to intrude." "Nonsense," Mrs. Holloway waved him to a chair. "Mrs. Shaw doesn't mind, do you, dear?" Vivian shook her head slightly. "Not at all." Isaac sat across from her, placing his hat on an empty chair. Mrs. Holloway bustled about, serving him coffee and promising a plate of eggs and bacon. "I didn't realize you were staying here too," Vivian said quietly. "Just arrived last night," he replied. "After I left you, I went to check if Mrs. Holloway had a room to spare. I've stayed here before when I'm between jobs." "Are you passing through then?" she asked, surprised to find herself curious. "For now," he said. "I've got work at the Patterson Ranch for a few weeks, breaking horses, Mrs. Holloway placed a heaping plate in front of Isaac. "This man has a way with horses like I've never seen," she told Vivian. "Gentlest touch in 3 counties, they say." Isaac looked embarrassed. "Mrs. Holloway exaggerates." "I do no such thing," the older woman huffed, then softened. "Vivian here used to teach at our schoolhouse. Best teacher we ever had until—" She trailed off, realizing too late where her words were leading. An awkward silence fell. Vivian stared at her half-eaten eggs, feeling the familiar pressure of tears building. "I should get going," she said abruptly, rising from her chair. "Thank you for breakfast, Mrs. Holloway. Where are you off to, dear?" Mrs. Holloway asked, concern evident in her voice. "The cemetery," Vivian replied, as she had every day for 3 weeks, "and then, I don't know." Isaac watched her, his expression unreadable. "Would you mind company?" he asked unexpectedly. "On your walk, I mean. I need to head that direction anyway, to the ranch." Vivian hesitated. Her daily visits to Matthew's grave were private rituals of grief. But something about Isaac's quiet presence the night before had been comforting rather than intrusive. "If you wish," she finally said. They walked in companionable silence through the morning bustle of Central City. The town was awake now, miners heading to their shifts, shopkeepers opening their doors, children running to school. Vivian kept her eyes forward, avoiding the sympathetic glances and whispered comments that followed her everywhere now. "They mean well," Isaac said quietly, noting her rigid posture. "I know," she replied, "but their pity feels like stones in my pockets weighing me down further." Isaac nodded. "Grief is lonely enough without feeling like a spectacle." They reached the cemetery gate and Vivian hesitated. "You don't have to come in, I know you have work." "I'm not in a hurry," he said simply. Matthew's grave looked different in the morning light. Less foreboding somehow, with wildflowers beginning to sprout around the edges of the fresh dirt. Vivian knelt and removed the wilted flowers from yesterday, replacing them with fresh ones she'd picked along the path. "He loved yellow," she said softly, "said they looked like tiny suns." Isaac remained standing, hat in hand, respecting her space but present nonetheless. "How old was he?" he asked gently. "4," Vivian answered, her throat tight. "Just turned 4 last month." What was he like? Isaac's question surprised her. Most people avoided mentioning Matthew directly, as if saying his name might shatter her completely. Vivian touched the small wooden cross. He was. Sunshine, always laughing, always curious, he collected rocks and leaves and bugs, wanted to know everything about everything. A small smile touched her lips for the first time in weeks. He once brought home a frog and tried to hide it in his toy box. I found it when it started croaking during his bedtime story. Isaac chuckled softly. Sounds like a fine boy. He was, Vivian said, the smile fading as quickly as it had appeared. He was everything. They stayed a while longer, Vivian telling more stories about Matthew, finding an unexpected relief in speaking his name aloud, in sharing memories that brought both pain and joy. Isaac listened, occasionally asking questions but mostly just bearing witness to her love and loss. When they finally left, Vivian felt different somehow. Not healed, she doubted that would ever be possible, but as if a tiny crack had appeared in the wall of grief surrounding her, letting in a breath of fresh air. At the crossroads where their paths would diverge, Isaac paused. "I'm heading to the ranch now, but would it be all right if I called on you tomorrow? Perhaps we could walk again." Vivian studied him, trying to discern his intentions. She saw nothing but sincerity in his weathered face. "Why?" she asked plainly. Isaac considered his answer carefully. "Because grief shouldn't be carried alone, and because talking about your boy seemed to bring you a moment's peace. That's reason enough, I think." His honesty disarmed her. "Yes," she found herself saying, "that would be all right." With a tip of his hat, Isaac turned toward the Patterson ranch, and Vivian continued into town, wondering what had possessed her to accept his offer. She had been determined to keep to herself, to nurture her grief like a garden of thorns. Yet something about Isaac Irwin's quiet presence made the burden seem fractionally lighter. The next morning, true to his word, Isaac was waiting on the porch of Mrs. Holloway's boarding house when Vivian came down for breakfast. "Good morning," he said, standing as she appeared. "Good morning," she replied, surprised to find she'd actually slept a few consecutive hours for the first time since Matthew's death. Their walk became a routine over the next week. Each morning, Isaac would accompany Vivian to the cemetery, listen as she shared memories of Matthew, then walk her back to town before heading to work at the Patterson ranch. Sometimes they walked in silence. Other times, Vivian found herself asking about his life. She learned that Isaac had grown up in Texas, the son of a rancher. He'd left home at 17 after his parents died in a fire, working his way north as a cowhand, occasionally serving as a scout for the army, though he spoke little of those days. He had no family left, save for distant cousins back east whom he'd never met. "Don't you get lonely?" Vivian asked him one morning as they sat beside Matthew's grave, which was now surrounded by a small garden of wildflowers that Isaac had helped her plant. "Used to it, I suppose," he answered, his fingers idly twisting a blade of grass. "The open country's good company if you know how to listen. But no roots anywhere, no place to call home." Isaac looked thoughtful. "Home's not always a place I've found. Sometimes it's just a feeling you carry." Vivian considered this. "I thought Central City was home. Matthew made it so now." She gestured vaguely. "Everything feels temporary, like I'm just passing through a world that no longer belongs to me." "What will you do?" Isaac asked. "Will you stay?" She sighed. "I don't know. There's nothing for me back east. My parents are gone, and Thomas's family never approved of me, but here, everywhere I look, I see Matthew." "Is that entirely bad?" Isaac ventured carefully, "having reminders. Sometimes they're a comfort," Vivian admitted, "but mostly they're like knives." The swing set behind the schoolhouse, the creek where we caught minnows, his favorite table at the bakery. She trailed off, fighting tears. Isaac hesitated, then reached out and gently covered her hand with his own. The touch was brief, respectful, but Vivian felt it like a spark, surprising her. "Maybe someday," he said softly, "those places will bring more comfort than pain." "Maybe," she whispered, though she couldn't imagine such a day. As they walked back to town, Vivian surprised herself by asking, "How long will you be working at the Patterson ranch?" "Another week or so," Isaac replied. "Then I'm not sure, might be another cattle drive starting next month." The thought of him leaving sent an unexpected pang through Vivian's chest. In just a week, his steady presence had become something she relied on, a tether to the world when grief threatened to sweep her away entirely. "I see," was all she said. That afternoon, for the first time since Matthew's death, Vivian didn't return directly to her room after visiting the cemetery. Instead, she found herself walking toward the schoolhouse where she had taught until Matthew fell ill. The building stood quiet now between sessions, the children home for the planting season. Mrs. Collins, the school board chairman's wife, spotted her from across the street and hurried over. "Vivian, oh, it's so good to see you out and about." Vivian managed a small smile. "Hello, Mrs. Collins. We've missed you terribly at the school," the older woman continued. "The children ask about you all the time." "And I miss them," Vivian admitted, surprised to find it was true. "Will you?" "That is, do you think you might return to teaching in the fall?" Mrs. Collins asked hesitantly. Vivian looked at the schoolhouse, memories washing over her. Matthew sitting in the back corner during her lessons, quietly drawing or looking at picture books, waiting for his mother to finish for the day. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I haven't thought that far ahead, Mrs. Collins patted her arm sympathetically. "Of course, dear, there's no rush. The position is yours whenever you're ready." As Vivian turned to leave, Mrs. Collins added, "I saw you walking with Isaac Irwin this morning. He's a good man, you know. Helped build our new barn last year when a storm destroyed the old one. Wouldn't take a penny for his work." "Yes," Vivian said. "He's been kind." "Kindness is a rare commodity these days," Mrs. Collins observed, "and that man has had his share of hardships too, from what I hear." Vivian wanted to ask what she meant, but Mrs. Collins was already continuing. "Anyway, it's good to see you with a friend. No one should face life's trials alone." That evening, Vivian sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The day had been unexpectedly full after leaving Mrs. Collins. She'd found herself drawn to the general store, then the bakery, places she'd avoided since Matthew's death. People had greeted her warmly, if cautiously, and for the first time in weeks, Vivian had felt something other than crushing grief. Not happiness, certainly, but perhaps the first tentative steps toward rejoining the world of the living. She heard footsteps on the wooden stairs and turned to see Isaac approaching, his clothes dusty from a day's work, a bruise darkening his left cheekbone. "What happened?" she asked as he lowered himself gingerly into the chair beside her. "Disagreement with a horse," he replied with a slight smile. He had strong opinions about being saddled. "You should put a cold cloth on that," Vivian said, frowning at the bruise. "It's nothing," he assured her. "Had worse from crankier horses." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken and the first stars appear. "I went to the schoolhouse today," Vivian said finally. "First time since Matthew." Isaac turned to her, genuine interest in his eyes. "How was it?" "Strange," she admitted. "Like visiting a place I knew in a dream. They've kept my position open for the fall term." "Will you take it?" Vivian sighed. "I used to love teaching, but now the thought of facing all those children, seeing their lives continuing while Matthew's—" She couldn't finish. "May I speak plainly?" Isaac asked, his voice gentle but serious. Vivian nodded, curious. "Grief is a territory without maps," he said, looking out at the darkening mountains. "No clear paths, no markers to tell you which way to turn, but I've observed that there are two ways people try to navigate it. Some build a shrine to their loss and live inside it. Others find a way to carry their loved ones with them as they step back into life." He paused. "I think your boy would want the second path for you." Tears pricked at Vivian's eyes, but they weren't the drowning waves of sorrow she'd become accustomed to. These felt different, cleaner somehow. "How did you become so wise about grief, Isaac Irwin?" she asked softly. He was quiet for so long that Vivian thought he might not answer. When he finally did, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I told you about my sister, but not about my wife and son." Vivian turned to him, surprised. "You were married?" Isaac nodded, his profile sharp against the twilight sky. 8 years ago in Kansas. Sarah was her name. Our boy was born sickly, lived just 2 days. Sarah never recovered from the birth. Fever took her a week later." "Oh, Isaac," Vivian breathed, her heart aching for him. "I did it wrong," he continued. "The Grieving built that shrine I mentioned and lived in it for years. Drifting, taking increasingly dangerous work, not caring much if I lived or died." He turned to her, his eyes shadowed but earnest. "It was a waste of the life they would have wanted for me. I don't want to see you make the same mistake." Vivian reached out and took his hand impulsively. "I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago," he said, his fingers curling gently around hers. "But watching you these past days, it brings it all back. You remind me of myself, except I see a strength in you I didn't have." "I don't feel strong," Vivian whispered. "Few strong people do," Isaac replied. "But you are. Getting up each day, facing your loss head-on, talking about your boy with love instead of hiding from his memory that takes courage." They sat in silence then, hands joined, as night fully descended on Central City. When Vivian finally rose to go inside, she felt something shift within her, as if a compass that had been spinning wildly had finally found north again. "Thank you," she said, standing at the door, "for sharing your story, for understanding." Isaac nodded, his expression soft in the porch lamplight. "Good night, Vivian." "Good night, Isaac." That night, Vivian dreamt of Matthew, not as she usually did, pale and still in his small bed, but running through a sunlit meadow, laughing, his face bright with joy. She woke with tears on her face, but they weren't entirely tears of sorrow. The next morning, instead of going directly to the cemetery, Vivian asked Isaac if they could walk through town first. "I'd like to stop at the general store," she explained. "I need seeds for Matthew's garden." Isaac smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "That sounds like a fine idea." Mr. Peterson at the general store couldn't hide his surprise when Vivian entered. "Mrs. Shaw, good to see you, madam. What can I help you with today?" "Flower seeds," Vivian said. "Sunflowers, if you have them, and perhaps some forget-me-nots." As Mr. Peterson gathered her order, Vivian noticed a display of small, carved wooden animals on the counter. She picked up a horse, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Just got those in," Mr. Peterson said. "Craftsman over in Denver makes them." "Matthew would have loved these," Vivian said softly then, after a moment's hesitation. "I'll take the horse as well." Isaac, who had been examining a new bridle on the wall, turned at her words, a question in his eyes. "For his grave," Vivian explained as they left the store. "He always wanted a pony." They continued to the cemetery, where Vivian carefully planted the seeds around Matthew's marker and placed the wooden horse at its base. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "A proper garden for my little collector." Isaac helped her water the freshly planted seeds, then surprised her by pulling a small leather-bound book from his coat pocket. "I thought, maybe you'd like to read to him. Children like stories." Vivian took the book, a collection of folk tales she recognized from her teaching days. The thoughtfulness of the gesture made her throat tighten. "Thank you," she managed, opening to the first page. And there, in the dappled shade of a pine tree, she read aloud to her son's spirit and the quiet cowboy who sat nearby, listening. When she finished, Vivian closed the book and looked up at Isaac. "Would you tell me more about your son?" she asked, "if it's not too painful." A shadow crossed his face, but he nodded. "His name was William. We called him Will." He paused, gathering memories. "He was so small, fit in the palm of my hand, but perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, Sarah's nose. My chin," Sarah insisted, though how she could tell on such a tiny face, I'll never know. Vivian listened as Isaac spoke of the brief time he'd had with his son, the hopes he and Sarah had nurtured during her pregnancy, the plans they'd made. His voice broke once when he described burying them both under a cottonwood tree near their homestead. "I couldn't stay there after," he admitted. "Sold the land, took to wandering, been doing it ever since." "And you've never thought of settling again?" Vivian asked gently. Isaac looked away toward the distant mountains. "Thought about it, even tried once or twice, but roots need the right soil to take hold." Something in his tone made Vivian wonder if he was speaking of more than just places. Their days fell into a pattern. Mornings at the cemetery, which gradually became less a place of overwhelming sorrow and more a peaceful spot to remember. Afternoons where Vivian slowly re-engaged with the town, visiting the library, helping Mrs. Holloway with baking, even stopping by the schoolhouse to sort books for the fall term. Isaac would join her in the evenings on the porch, sharing stories of his day at the ranch, occasionally bringing small gifts, a wildflower he'd spotted on the trail, a particularly interesting stone that reminded him of Matthew's collection. Sometimes they'd walk to the small park in the center of town, watching the sunset together. 2 weeks passed this way, and Vivian realized with surprise that she had gone an entire day without crying. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but it had changed form, less a drowning wave, more a shadow that walked alongside her. Then came the morning Isaac arrived at breakfast looking troubled. "Everything all right?" Vivian asked as they walked toward the cemetery. He hesitated before answering. "Got word yesterday. That cattle drive I mentioned is starting next week. They need experienced hands." "Oh," Vivian said, a cold weight settling in her stomach. "You'll be leaving then?" "I told them I'd think on it," Isaac replied, not meeting her eyes. "It's good money." They walked in silence after that, both lost in thought. At Matthew's grave, now flourishing with sprouting seedlings and the wooden horse standing guard, Vivian found herself unable to share stories as she usually did. The thought of returning to her solitary existence after Isaac left filled her with a dread that surprised her with its intensity. "Vivian," Isaac said finally, breaking the heavy silence. Whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider appeared on the path. Frank Patterson, owner of the ranch where Isaac worked. His face was grim as he dismounted. "Irwin," he called. "Thought I might find you here." He nodded politely to Vivian. "Mrs. Shaw." "Something wrong, Mr. Patterson?" Isaac asked, standing. "Trouble at the ranch," Patterson said tersely. "That new stallion broke loose this morning. Injured 2 men trying to catch him, then bolted. He's heading for the high country and we need to catch him before he gets too far or hurts someone else." Isaac nodded, immediately understanding the urgency. "I'll come now." He turned to Vivian, regret clear in his eyes. "I'm sorry." "Go," she said, trying to mask her disappointment. "It's important." Isaac hesitated, then quickly retrieved something from his saddlebag. "I was going to give you this later," he said, pressing a small package wrapped in brown paper into her hands. "Open it when you have a moment alone." Before Vivian could respond, he had mounted his horse and was following Patterson down the trail, turning once to look back at her before disappearing around a bend. Vivian sat beside Matthew's grave for a long time after they left, the unopened package in her lap. Finally, with trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. Inside was a small leather journal, its cover embossed with a single sunflower. When she opened it, she found the first page filled with Isaac's neat, angular handwriting for Vivian to record memories of Matthew so they may never fade. And perhaps, someday, to write new chapters of your own story, with admiration for your courage, Isaac. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes, but these were different from the tears of grief she'd become so familiar with. These were tears of gratitude, of connection, of something else she wasn't quite ready to name. 2 days passed with no word from Isaac. Vivian found herself watching the road each evening, hoping to see his tall figure approaching. On the 3rd morning, Mrs. Holloway brought news with breakfast. "Heard from Mrs. Patterson that they're still tracking that wild stallion," she reported. "Led them quite a chase up into the mountains. Isaac's the only one who got close enough for a lasso, but the beast nearly took him over a cliff for his trouble." Vivian's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. "Is he hurt?" "Scraped up some," she said, "but you know men and their pride wouldn't stop to have his injuries tended properly." Mrs. Holloway shook her head disapprovingly, determined to bring that horse in himself, apparently. Vivian spent the day in a state of distracted worry, finding herself repeatedly glancing toward the mountains visible from town. That evening, a summer thunderstorm rolled in, bringing driving rain and flashes of lightning that illuminated the peaks in stark relief. "Dreadful weather for them to be out in," Mrs. Holloway fretted as she served dinner to her boarders. "I hope they've found shelter." Vivian couldn't eat, her thoughts with Isaac somewhere in those dark mountains. She excused herself early and retreated to her room where she sat by the window, watching the storm rage outside. She must have dozed off in the chair, because a sudden pounding on the front door startled her awake. Voices carried up the stairs, "Mrs. Holloway's exclamation, then men's deeper tones, urgent and strained, throwing a shawl around her nightdress. Vivian hurried to the landing. In the entryway below stood two ranch hands, supporting a third figure between them, Isaac, drenched and pale, his right arm hanging at an awkward angle. "Get him to the sofa," Mrs. Holloway was directing. "Vivian, thank goodness you're awake. Run fetch Dr. Miller, quickly." Vivian was already moving, grabbing her coat from the hook and dashing out into the rain without bothering with shoes. She ran through puddles and mud, her nightdress growing sodden, until she reached the doctor's house on Cedar Street. Dr. Miller, accustomed to late-night emergencies, was grabbing his bag before Vivian had finished explaining. They hurried back through the storm to find Isaac laid out on Mrs. Holloway's sofa, his face tight with pain. "Dislocated shoulder, looks like," Dr. Miller assessed after a brief examination, "and a nasty gash on his back that'll need stitching." "What happened?" "Horse dragged him when the rope tangled," one of the ranch hands explained. "Would have been worse if he hadn't managed to get free when he did. The stallion went over a ravine, didn't make it." Vivian's eyes met Isaac's across the room. She saw regret there and something else, relief perhaps, at seeing her. "Everyone out except Mrs. Shaw, doctor," Miller ordered, rolling up his sleeves. "I'll need her assistance, and this fellow needs fewer gawkers and more medical attention." As the others filed out, the doctor turned to Vivian. "I need to set this shoulder first. It'll be painful. Can you hold him steady?" Vivian nodded, kneeling beside Isaac and placing her hands firmly on his good shoulder and chest. His skin was warm despite his drenched clothes, his heartbeat strong under her palm. "Ready?" Dr. Miller asked Isaac, who gave a grim nod. The crack of the joint relocating made Vivian flinch, but Isaac merely inhaled sharply, his body going rigid beneath her hands. "Good man," the doctor approved. "Now let's see that back." With Vivian's help, they carefully removed Isaac's torn shirt. The gash across his back was long but not dangerously deep. As Dr. Miller cleaned and stitched the wound, Vivian held Isaac's hand, offering what comfort she could. "You had me worried," she whispered. A ghost of a smile touched Isaac's lips. "Didn't mean to." The stallion. Isaac's expression darkened. Couldn't save him, lost his footing in the storm, went down a ravine, beautiful animal, wild to his end. When Dr. Miller finished, he left a bottle of laudanum and strict instructions for rest. "No riding, no lifting, no foolishness for at least a week," he warned Isaac. "That shoulder needs time to heal properly." After the doctor left, Mrs. Holloway helped Vivian make up a bed for Isaac in the small ground floor room usually reserved for storage. "Can't have him climbing stairs with that injury," she declared. When they had him settled, Mrs. Holloway discreetly withdrew, leaving Vivian alone with Isaac. Rain continued to drum on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound around them. "You should sleep," Vivian said, adjusting his pillow. "Stay a moment," Isaac asked, his voice roughened by pain and exhaustion. Vivian sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his hand. "I was afraid," she admitted. "When I heard about the chase and then the storm." "I've weathered worse," he said, but his fingers tightened around hers. "Though I admit there was a moment when that horse was dragging me toward the ravine that I thought." He trailed off, then added softly, "I thought of you, of Matthew's grave, of things unfinished." Vivian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "The cattle drive," she said. "Will you still go?" Isaac studied her face in the lamplight. "Do you want me to stay?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning neither had dared acknowledge until now. "Yes," Vivian whispered. "I do." Something shifted in Isaac's eyes, hope mingled with caution. "I've been alone a long time, Vivian. Made peace with it, or thought I had. Then I saw you in that cemetery and something changed, for me too," she admitted, tears threatening. "I thought grief was all I had left, all I deserved maybe." "No," Isaac said firmly. "You deserve joy, Vivian, so did Matthew, so do I perhaps. If we're brave enough to reach for it." He lifted his good hand to her face, his touch feather light against her cheek. "I'll stay," he promised. "As long as you want me to." Vivian leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "Thank you for the journal," she said. "It was perfect." "Have you written in it yet?" She shook her head. "Not yet, but I will." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "Perhaps we can fill it together." Isaac's smile was the last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed him, his hand going slack in hers as he drifted to sleep. Vivian remained beside him, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, feeling a tentative peace settle over her, not erasing her grief for Matthew, but existing alongside it, like stars appearing in a night sky. Summer gave way to early autumn, the aspens on the mountainsides turning gold almost overnight. Isaac's shoulder healed, though on cold mornings Vivian would catch him rotating it carefully, working out the stiffness. He had taken a permanent position at the Patterson Ranch, overseeing the horse training program, which allowed him to return to town each evening. Their courtship progressed slowly, respectfully. Walks through town, Sunday picnics in the meadow, evenings on Mrs. Holloway's porch talking until the stars emerged. Isaac was careful never to rush Vivian, understanding that her heart was still healing. The journal he had given her gradually filled first with memories of Matthew, then increasingly with observations of her renewed life. The day she returned to the schoolhouse to prepare for fall classes. The first time she laughed without feeling guilty afterward. The afternoon, Isaac taught her to ride the gentle mare he had selected especially for her from the Patterson Ranch stock. In late September, Isaac took Vivian to a special spot he had discovered in the foothills, a small clearing surrounded by aspen trees, their golden leaves shimmering in the breeze. A creek meandered along one edge and wildflowers still bloomed in protected patches. "It's beautiful," Vivian said, turning in a slow circle to take in the view. "I thought it might be a good spot for a home," Isaac said carefully, "if a person were inclined to put down roots." Vivian looked at him sharply, understanding dawning. "Isaac," he took her hands in his. "I've been saving," he said. "Between my ranch wages and what I had put aside before, it's enough for a small start, a cabin here, maybe a few horses of our own." "Are you asking me something, Isaac Irwin?" Vivian asked, her heart beating faster. "I'm asking if you might consider sharing a future with me," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Not to replace what you lost, nothing could do that, but to build something new alongside those precious memories." Tears filled Vivian's eyes. "Matthew will always be part of me," she said. "As he should be," Isaac nodded. "I would never ask otherwise." Vivian looked around the clearing again, trying to picture it a small cabin with a porch, perhaps a garden where she could plant Matthew's favorite flowers, room for Isaac's horses. "What about your wandering ways?" she asked. "You've been a drifter so long, would you truly be happy staying in one place?" "I've been searching," Isaac replied thoughtfully. "For what, I wasn't sure until I met you, not just a place to belong, but a reason to belong." He squeezed her hands gently. "I found that reason in a cemetery at sunset, sitting beside a woman braver than anyone I've ever known." Vivian stepped closer to him, resting her forehead against his chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will share a future with you, Isaac." His arms came around her, strong and steady. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home after a long journey, the taste of possibility, of renewal, of life continuing despite its inevitable sorrows. They were married on a crisp October day in Central City's small church. The entire town seemed to attend, Mrs. Holloway dabbing at her eyes throughout the ceremony, Dr. Miller beaming from the front pew, Mrs. Collins and the schoolchildren throwing flower petals as the couple emerged. After the celebration, Isaac and Vivian rode to Matthew's grave. They had placed a proper headstone now, with his full name, Matthew Thomas Shaw, and the words, "Beloved son, forever in our hearts." Vivian laid her bouquet beside it, and Isaac placed a carved wooden horse next to the weather-worn one that had stood guard these many months. "I will always love you, my sweet boy," Vivian whispered, "and I will live fully for both of us." As they turned to leave, a sunbeam broke through the clouds, illuminating the small grave and the thriving garden around it. Vivian took it as a sign, Matthew's blessing on this new chapter of her life. Their cabin took shape through the winter, Isaac working alongside the builders whenever he wasn't needed at the ranch. By spring, it was finished, a sturdy, welcoming structure nestled among the aspens, with a wide porch facing the mountains and a small stable nearby. "There's one more thing," Isaac said on the day they moved in their few belongings. He led Vivian to a small room off the main living area, a space she had assumed would be used for storage. When he opened the door, Vivian gasped. Inside was a child's bedroom, simply but lovingly furnished with a small bed, a bookshelf filled with children's books, and a toy chest. "For visits from your students, perhaps," Isaac explained hesitantly. "Or, someday, if you wanted." He trailed off, uncertain of her reaction. Vivian touched the carved bedpost, her heart full. "It's perfect," she said. "A room of possibilities." That night, as they sat on their new porch watching the stars emerge, Vivian took out the journal Isaac had given her nearly a year before. It was almost full now. "I've been thinking," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "Maybe we should get a new one, running out of pages." Isaac asked, his arm comfortably around her. "Running into a new chapter," Vivian replied. She took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "One that will need its own book." Isaac went very still, then turned to look at her, wonder dawning in his eyes. "Vivian, are you saying?" She nodded, tears of joy shimmering in her eyes. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Isaac." His embrace was gentle but fierce, his joy palpable as he held her close, whispering words of love and gratitude against her hair. Later, as they lay in bed, Isaac placed his hand protectively over Vivian's still flat stomach. "I'm scared," he admitted in the darkness, "after Will." "I know," Vivian whispered. "I'm scared too. Loving always means risking loss, but we know that better than most, don't we? And we're still here, still brave enough to try." "Bravest woman I know," Isaac murmured, kissing her temple. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. The child's room slowly filled with more treasures, handmade quilts from Mrs. Holloway, toys carved by Mr. Peterson, books from Mrs. Collins and the school. Vivian continued teaching until the end of the term, when her condition became too evident to ignore. Through it all, they maintained their morning ritual of visiting Matthew's grave, now thriving with perennials that returned season after season. Vivian would sit and tell her firstborn about his coming sibling, about the cabin, about Isaac and their life together. "He or she will know all about you," she promised Matthew. "Your love of yellow flowers and collecting treasures, your laugh, your curiosity, you will always be their big brother." As her time grew near, Vivian's fears increased. The memory of Matthew's illness, of sitting helpless as fever claimed him, haunted her dreams. Isaac, too, grew quieter, the ghost of his first wife's childbed death clearly weighing on him. One night, unable to sleep, Vivian found Isaac sitting on the porch, staring at the star-filled sky. "What if I can't protect them?" he asked as she eased herself down beside him. "Either of you," Vivian took his hand, placing it where their child kicked vigorously. "Feel that strength, Isaac, life insisting on itself despite all odds." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "We can't protect against everything, we know that better than most. But we can love fiercely while we have the chance." The baby came on a summer dawn, after a night of labor that left both Vivian and Isaac exhausted but triumphant. Dr. Miller pronounced mother and child perfectly healthy, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's cleft chin. "What will you name him?" Mrs. Holloway asked. Having arrived to help with the delivery, Vivian looked at Isaac, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed this at length. "William Matthew Irwin," Vivian announced, for both the brothers watching over him. The first few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, nursing sessions, and overwhelming love. Little Will was a hearty baby with a strong grip and an even stronger set of lungs. Isaac would pace the cabin with him at night, singing old Cattle Drive songs in a low, soothing voice that never failed to calm the infant. When Will was a month old, they took him to meet his brother. The cemetery was ablaze with summer flowers, butterflies dancing among the blossoms around Matthew's grave. "Matthew," Vivian said, her voice steady as she knelt with Will cradled in her arms. "This is your brother, Will. Will, this is Matthew, who taught me how to love being a mother." Isaac stood behind them, his hand on Vivian's shoulder, watching as she carefully placed the baby on a blanket beside the grave. Will waved his tiny fists, gurgling at a butterfly that landed momentarily on the headstone. "Look," Isaac said softly, "they're already getting acquainted." The years passed, marked by the seasons changing around their cabin in the Aspens. Will grew into a sturdy boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's curious mind. When he was 3, he was joined by a sister, Sarah Josephine, with copper curls and a determined spirit. The children grew up knowing Matthew's story, visiting his grave regularly to leave treasures. They thought he might like interesting stones, feathers, once a tiny frog that Will was convinced his big brother in heaven would appreciate. They asked questions about the brother they'd never met, and Vivian answered honestly, finding that sharing Matthew's memory with them kept him present in their family in a way that felt right and natural. Isaac expanded their property gradually, adding more horses, building a larger stable, eventually hiring hands to help with what had become a respectable breeding operation. Vivian returned to teaching part-time as the children grew, finding joy in introducing new generations to the wonder of learning. There were hard times, a harsh winter when they nearly lost the herd, a bout of scarlet fever that terrified them all, but that the children, thankfully, recovered from, the inevitable arguments and adjustments that come with building a life together. But through it all, the foundation remained solid, 2 people who had found each other in their darkest moments and chosen to build light together. On a golden autumn afternoon, 10 years after they had first met, Vivian and Isaac sat on their porch, watching Will help Sarah learn to ride her new pony in the paddock nearby. "You ever think about how we met?" Vivian asked, her head resting against Isaac's shoulder. "Often," he replied, his arm around her waist. "Though I wish it had been under happier circumstances for you." Vivian watched her children laugh as the little pony trotted in a circle. "I used to think it was cruel that life would give me such joy in Matthew only to take him away. Then such pain, only to bring you into my life because of it." She turned to look at her husband, the years having added dignified lines to his weathered face. "But I've come to think perhaps that's what life is, joy and sorrow so tightly woven together that you can't separate them and wouldn't want to if you could." Isaac kissed her forehead gently. "Wise woman." "I had good teachers," she said, thinking of Matthew, of Isaac, of their children. "And I had a man who sat beside me in silence when I needed it most, who saw me at my most broken and still believed I was strong." "You were," Isaac said simply. "You are." In the paddock, Will was now leading his sister's pony in a wider circle, his face serious with responsibility. Sarah bounced in the saddle, her curls flying, shouting, "Faster!" with complete confidence in her brother's care. Vivian took out the newest journal, they were on their 4th now, and recorded the moment, as she had so many others. Not to hold on to the past, but to honor the present, to remind herself always of the preciousness of each day with those she loved. That evening, after the children were asleep, Vivian and Isaac walked hand in hand to the edge of their property, where a small stand of aspens caught the last light of day. The leaves shimmered gold and crimson, whispering in the gentle breeze. "I never thought I'd find peace again," Vivian said, watching the fading light play through the trees. "After Matthew, I thought that part of my life was over." "I know," Isaac said. "I felt the same after Sarah and Will, as if joy was something meant for other people, not for me." Vivian turned to him, taking in the face she had come to know as well as her own. "Thank you," she said simply, "for sitting with me that day, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." Isaac gathered her into his arms, still strong despite the passing years. "Thank you for teaching me how to stay," he replied, "for giving me roots that go deeper than any I've ever known." As darkness fell, they made their way back to the warm light of their cabin, where their children slept safely and dreams of the future mingled with memories of the past, all parts of a life built with courage, day by day, from the broken pieces of what had come before. And in the cemetery on the hill, under a blanket of stars, wildflowers continued to bloom around a small headstone, tended by many loving hands, a testament to a little boy who had lived briefly, but whose legacy of love continued to grow season after season in the hearts of those who remembered him.